Hi, Tim here from hellolux.com with another Cinema 4D tutorial, and in this quick tip we're going to look at how we can use objects to create custom wireframes. I'm in Cinema 4D and you can see that my scene scale is set to millimeters. I've got this skull object and you can see that it's not a very dense wireframe, and you can use any object you like. It should work with this technique. And if you want to adjust the density of the wireframe itself, one of the easiest ways to do that is just to select your object, press Shift-C and then just type Remesh. Hold down Alt and add the remesh object as a parent. So by default it's set to 100, so the density it produces is more or less the same, but we can set this much lower. So if we set that to say 25, you will get a much lower density. And of course you can go the opposite way and you can set this to say 500 if you want to have a really dense mesh. So the effect that I want will work perfectly fine just with the skull as it is. I'm going to hold Alt, just double click to hide that skull for now, and let's come to our spline menu, add in a helix. I'm going to set this to be ZY with a start radius of 0.4 and an end radius of 0.4. We'll leave it at 720 for the end angle, and we'll make the height 10. Okay, so this is going to be one of the threads that we're going to use. I'm going to take this and make a copy and then another copy. Let's come up and add in a cloner. We're going to set this to be radial. Let's take our 3 helices, drop them into the cloner, come back to the cloner. Let's select that and set the plane here to ZY as well. And I'm going to set the radius to be 0 and count to be 3. Now obviously it's very precise. They're all exactly the same at the moment. So I'm just going to come and just vary them slightly. So let's set the start of this one to be 0.3. So it's a slight thinner at one end. We can adjust the radial bias and the height bias. Okay, and the radial bias you're not going to see too much because it's only a small difference between each end. It just adjusts whereabouts that changes. We can do the same on this one. So if we set this to be 0.3 at this end, and let's adjust this bias so it's something like so. Oh, yeah, maybe there, and then this. Pull this one down. Okay, and there you go. And you can see if we come to our end and press O, that we do have a little bit of variation there. We're going to vary this some more because at the moment it's perfectly straight. So I'm going to select the cloner, hold Alt, just add a null, and then with Alt add another null. Okay, and then with this one selected, we can call this thread. I'm going to come to my top view. Let's come down here. And I'm going to select my pen tool and I'm just going to draw some kind of curve. Maybe like this. And then let's press F4, press O. We can drag these points tangents, but you can't because I've got 2 objects selected. There we go. It's annoying when it does that, but there we go. We can even adjust these if we want. Okay, so let's put that spline in here and then select this null, hold Shift. Let's come to our deformers menu, add in a spline wrap. So this spline wrap is going to affect everything in this hierarchy, so it's going to affect the cloner basically. This spline wrap, we're going to take our spline, drop it into there. You can see now that our cloner has warped slightly. And if we come back to our perspective view, you can see that now it's looking a little bit more organic. Now you could go through and make a few of these or make some and blend between them, but we're just going to stick with this one for now. Let's make a few more adjustments. First of all, I'm going to select the helix objects by shift clicking. Come down here and you can see we've got subdivision. It's set to 100. Now that does result in a lovely smooth spline, but as usual, we need to be slightly wary of point count because we're going to be cloning this across our object. So we can set this probably much lower. Let's try something insanely low like 3. Okay, and you can see that that has changed the result. So maybe we're going to go somewhere a bit higher, maybe 8. Okay, and I think that feels pretty good. And you can see where each individual point is going to be. So it's still quite a few points. But what we can do here is set this lower to say 2. Okay, there we go. And that's looking pretty good. And we can probably subdivide this at render time. So we want to keep those point counts as low as possible. And that does look slightly jagged. But when we zoom out to somewhere like here, you can see that that's feeling smooth already. So that's reduced the point count down considerably. The other thing we can do is come back to spline wrap here, and in the size we've got this thing here. So let's just pull these down, maybe not all the way down, maybe to like 0.1 or something. And then let's just set these to be pointing upwards so that our rope or our piece of thread kind of gets a bit thinner at each point here where we're going to put knots there. In fact, let's pull these up. Okay. And you can hold Alt and middle mouse here to just adjust these. There we go. So now you can see it's just coming down a little bit thinner at each end. We should be good with this. So let's come up, hide this spline so we can see our result without that middle spline. It's looking pretty cool. Let's fold that up. Come up to Mograph menu. Let's add in a cloner. We'll call this one cloner threads. And I'm going to set this to be object. Let's take our threads and drop them in here. Select the cloner, and we need to drag the skull in here as the object. But you should really put the skull before the cloner, otherwise what will happen is it has to do 2 redraws because it starts at the top and assesses or evaluates each object as we go down. So select the cloner, let's add in the skull. Okay, press H to view this in the viewport. Maybe we want to see our skull now. There we go. Okay, not looking very convincing yet. Let's press NC to hide our wireframe. On the cloner here, first of all, let's set this to multi-instance so that we are very memory efficient. And we're going to set the distribution to be edge. Now we have all of our threads distributed on the edges. We can use this scale on edge command, but you can see that currently they are far too large and they are oriented incorrectly. So before I continue, I'm going to come in here, and what I'm actually going to do is take the spline wrap and just disable that for now, because it can be a little bit spurious when the input spline is changing size, and we don't want things jumping around. We can come back to this in a bit. On the cloner itself, under the transform tab, I'm going to set the rotation bank to be 90. That should lay them across the surface, and then if we press the S of scale to select the X, Y, and Z, hold down Control and then just drag on one of these parameters, you can see that now it's scaling down. So it's not quite right, but you can see we are getting a result. Now the reason it isn't looking correct is because of the settings under the Object tab. First of all, we need to set the offset to be 0 because the helix has its axes at the beginning, not in the middle. So we want to start at one end. And you can see that's already starting to look better. But they're all different sizes, and that's because we haven't enabled the scale on edge. So they're all the same size basically, and we want them to change depending on the size of the edge. So if we enable that, you can see that now we are getting a result. We want the edge scale to be 100 so that they're the full length of that edge. And now you can see that they're too long essentially. So if we come here and we come back to our transform tab, we can adjust the scale here. So I'm going to just hold Control and drag this. It's a little bit tricky to see because at the moment the actual thread itself is intersecting the surface. So let's take our position Z and let's increase that to maybe 0.15. And now we can see all of our thread. And if we come here and we can scrub the actual scale, and you can see now that's looking pretty good. Coming back to the Object Manager, let's unfold the hierarchy and enable our spline wrap. And there we go, you can now see it's all looking a little bit more organic. If we come to the cloner itself, what we can do is come up and add in a random effector. Switch to the parameter tab. Let's disable position and enable rotation, and then we just want to rotate these around. I think it's probably P. There we go. Yeah, so if we set that to be 360, then we get some more randomness, because obviously they all rotate and we view them from different angles, so it's starting to feel a little bit more handmade. If you feel the threads themselves are a little bit too thin, you can always adjust the scale in the cloner under transform. So depending on the orientation of your original object will depend on which you have to adjust, but for this it's the Y and the Z channels. So if we select just those two and hold Control and drag these, you can see that now we can adjust the kind of radius. Maybe 0.15, 0.175, there, something like that. Feels good. Okay, if you come up and open up your material manager, double click to create a new material, and with this material just set the weight for the base color and reflection to 0. So essentially you get a black material, just drop that onto the skull, and then we can see this without any shading. And you can see it's working pretty well. Next thing I want to do is create knots on each of these points here. So I'm going to just jump into a new scene to do that. Okay, the effect that I'm after isn't really a knot. It's more like lots of wire sort of wound around. So we can do that using a couple of nulls and a vibrate tag combined with a tracer. So let's add in a null, hold shift, add another one. Let's call this second one tracer null. Okay, with both of these selected, come to the object tab. Let's set them to be, say, circle with a radius of 1, just so we can see something in the viewport, maybe a bit bigger. 2. Let's also right click and choose animation tags and add a vibrate tag to both of these. Now with the tracer null, I'm going to switch to coordinates and set this to be 20 centimeters away from the origin. Now with the parent null, we're going to select that vibrate tag, come down and let's enable rotation. Leave the frequency at 2, but let's set the amplitude to be 90 and then 720. Now if we select the tracer null here, come to the Mograph menu and add in a tracer object. I'm going to take that out of the hierarchy. I've just got mine to place it next. Yours will probably appear at the top. Switch to the object tab. You can see it's added in that null into the link just because we had it selected. We don't really need to change anything else on here. Now if we press play, we should see a result. And there we go. You can see we are getting a result. Not quite what we want because everything is all on one plane, almost. So what I'm going to do is come to this vibrate. I'm going to enable position, set that to 0, and then just have this on Z. So maybe 2, just so it moves from side to side as well. Now if we press play, you can see we get this effect, like so. So I'm going to right click on the tracer and just choose current state to object, and we get that as a spline. We can disable that, come up here, and let's just change the seed for these. And let's do the same thing again. Rewind first. There we go. And then right click, choose current state to object. If you don't like the result, just simply change the random seed, rewind, and do it again. They've all got that kind of chaotic random feel to them. And when we get into rendering, we can subdivide those to make them nice and smooth. I'm just going to do 2 more. Okay, so now we can select these. I'm going to save my file, cut, save, close, paste. Next I'm going to add in a cloner. Let's grab these, drop them in to the cloner. We're going to set this to be object. Drag this skull in here. I'm going to fold this up. Let's rename this random threads, just so we know which cloner it's working on, and we can call this one cloner knots, and we just want to pull this down below so it's underneath the skull in the hierarchy. Now at the moment the knots obviously are huge. We're going to choose to distribute on the vertex. If we switch to transform here, let's set this to 0.01. Okay, and there we go. And they're a little bit small, but they're actually intersecting the geometry. So let's set this to 0.2, maybe 0.175, something like that. Okay. And then the next thing I'm going to do is just add in another random effector. This time we're going to switch off position, enable scale, uniform scale, set that to say 0.25. So we get a little bit of variation there, and then enable rotation, set the bank here to be 360, and there we get nice variation in rotation. And there we go. They're actually almost a little bit too big still. Also, because we've offset these 0.175, we should do the same for the threads because they're 0.15 and they need to line up. We just offset that slightly. You can see now they should align their centers. And if we want, we can just actually select these, press T for scale, and we can just scale them in the viewport. I'm on the wrong tool. There we go. Like so. And that's okay. We should be almost ready to render. I am going to add in a camera. Let's make this the active camera and just frame this maybe something like so, just so that we can see what it's going to look like. I'm going to add in an area light, and then what we can do is we can come up to here, cameras, and choose use camera and then selected object as camera. So now we're looking through that light. So I'm going to come up and make this a key light, sort of somewhere here. Looks pretty good. Let's duplicate this, and we're still looking through area light 1. So let's move that around here, make this the fill. So we're going to have it a bit lower, something like so. Okay, and we can call this one fill, this one key, and I'm going to set that key to be a sort of goldy color and the fill to be quite blue. Let's make this fill a bit bigger, 40 by 40. Okay, and the key, fill, camera, we can pull these down into my scene null. Now if we switch back to the camera, next thing we need to do is to create a material, and I'm just going to create a regular redshift material, not the standard material. The reason for that is just because it's got these presets, and I'm just going to choose gold, and let's set the roughness to 0.25 and drag this onto the cloner, both of them. Now if we open the redshift render view and start the renderer, you're going to see that we get nothing. Now the reason for that is because you can't render these splines without using the redshift object tag. So let's fold open our cloners, and if we select these helices and just right click and choose render tags RS object, and then we do the same down here. Okay, and we just want to select all of those. And for the mode here under the curve tab, if you don't see this curve tab, then you don't have this on a curve essentially. What we're going to do here is choose, we could choose hair strands, but I'm going to choose cylinders. We can adjust the thickness, but we need to render it, and we can also use this mesh subdivision down here. Okay, I'm going to just come up and start the render engine. And there we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make it so that the skull itself is also rendered, and then we should get a much clearer view of the result. There we go. So we can't really see the actual knots for some reason. So let's just come in and have a look. All right, so they are there. They're just rendering really thin. Okay, and you can see these are quite segmented, and they're also a little bit thin. Now, the reason that these knots are thin like this in comparison with the actual threads is because of the scale of the objects on the cloner. So that's a mistake, really. So here we've got 0.01, and here we've got 0.175, so there's quite a big difference. So what we should really do here is put this to be the same. Let's just click here, 0.175, like so. Now of course they're huge, so we're going to need to select these, press T for scale, and in fact I'll just disable this for a moment, and now we can just scale these down in the viewport to the size that we want, which is probably something like this. Now let's restart the render and have a look, and we should get the same thickness. There we go. Now they're the same thickness, which is good. Let's just zoom out a bit so we can see this from a slightly wider shot. Now select all of these redshift object tags, except for that material tag here. I'm going to set the thickness here to be 2.5. I'm not going to use the subdivision. You can use that if you come in close to reduce any faceting, or you can resample these splines themselves. But I think at this sort of distance or further away, we don't need to. And by enabling any of these, it's going to use a lot more memory and take longer to render. So I think this is looking pretty sweet. Let's just pull out so we can see a slightly better shot. On the camera itself, under display, let's enable the focus plane. And under optical, I'm going to enable bokeh bladed with 5 blades. I'm going to set the aperture to say 4. And let's set the focus distance here to be 30. Maybe that's not quite right. There we go. And you can see the focus plane works by tinting the area behind a different color. That feels pretty good. So we can come back here and just switch that off. So I've just rendered out a full screen version so we can have a look at it. It's a pretty flexible effect. Once you've got this set up, you can change the input geometry to more or less any kind of object that you want to create this netting on. And creating a net is an obvious use for this. Even though we've used gold wire here, you can just use regular sort of rope, string vest. But you can also clone many other objects onto the edges and vertices to create all sorts of effects. For instance, the classic atom array. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this free tutorial from me, Tim Clapham. If you want more content, please head over to hellolux.com, where we have a whole bunch of free tutorials and also paid professional training.